I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Hello everybody, Dr. Alex Vasquez coming to you live. Right now what I'm going to do is address this new social fad where people are saying, I've seen this in some replies to my messages, so I'm just going to address this very quickly, where people are saying that viruses don't exist, infections don't exist, and if infections don't exist, therefore bacteria also don't exist. So those are the responses that I've seen online. I realize I have to say that this is really stupid, but apparently it's enough of a fad that it seems to be popular enough. I'm going to go ahead and try to address it, even though I think it's almost, I mean, this is almost like a flat earth type argument, but I'll go ahead and work with it a little bit. So people, for example, these days, among people who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about, the popular refrain appears to be that viruses don't exist. And the subset of that is that if you or I talk about any given virus, they'll say, well, this virus hasn't been isolated. I mean, it's a level of ignorance that's kind of stunning, but I'll go ahead and try to, again, address it. And within the post of this, I'll show you the articles in just a moment, but I'm also going to post the articles and you can look at them yourself and do what you want. But, the idea that viruses don't exist demonstrates not only a person's ignorance of, like formal study, and I of course appreciate that most people haven't, studied, basic and clinical microbiology. I understand that. I don't think people should have to study those courses in order to at least understand that viruses exist and bacteria exist and infections exist and the earth is round and rocks are hard and water is wet. I mean, we all have a certain level of life experience that kind of confirms things for us. By the time someone's in their 20s, then they probably know somebody who's had herpes, either type 1 or type 2. 50% of the world population has herpes type 1, 20% of the world population has herpes type 2. A lot of people, fewer people, but still a lot of people have, hepatitis B, which is a virus infection, hepatitis type C, another virus infection. So, I mean, just through basic life experience, a person would know that infections exist and they behave as infections. And I'll talk a little bit about the behavior of infections in just a moment. Some of it's based on, kind of earlier models and earlier conceptualizations, and those were fine for the time. Just like the technology of virus isolation was also the best they had at the time. But when people say that, so-and-so virus hasn't been isolated, they're really showing that they're really showing a kind of a deep level of ignorance of, like, even the vocabulary of what they're talking about, or they're using the vocabulary and they have no idea what they're talking about. So on the screen, I've listed, the steps of what is virus isolation. And it's somewhat intuitive, and it also appears to be based on Koch's postulates, which I'll review in just a moment. I already have the articles ready to go. So, a researcher, I don't recall his first name, but I guess I'll look it up real quick. Robert Koch was a early microbiologist, and in the 19th century, so in the 1800s. So he developed just a way of thinking about infections. And these were later called Koch's postulates, or they were later popularized as Koch's postulates. They were actually discovered by someone else, but apparently Robert Koch was better at social media at the time, and so he got the credit for this. I'll show you that article as well. I mean, this is all just medical history, biology history. If you don't want to call it medical history, call it biological history. So Koch's postulates, and by the way, I said what I just said because part of this, rash of ignorance that's becoming popular right now to deny the existence of viruses, part of it's kind of anti-medical. And I think we might not agree with that, but I think we can all understand that because, especially we're all aware of corruption in medicine. We're all aware of fear-mongering in medicine. We've all been, inundated for the past 5 years with this COVID pandemic bullshit. And when I say it's bullshit, I'm not saying that every aspect of it's bullshit. Some people obviously died. Some people died from medical causes, overuse of ventilators, overuse of sedative drugs to suppress respiration, overcounting of the cases, exaggeration of the severity of the illness, exaggeration of the effectiveness of vaccines, suppressing generic, inexpensive medications, pushing drugs that had been complete failures, pushing them into the limelight, and then spending billions of dollars. I mean, this was a lot of bullshit. I know. I think we all know that it was a lot of bullshit, but that doesn't mean that every aspect of it was bullshit, and that doesn't mean that we can then say, well, the entire field of virology is therefore bullshit. The entire field of microbiology is therefore bullshit. Infectious diseases don't exist. I mean, that's where people are going with this. So, the blame, as has been said, the blame for this, rejection of everything related to virology, immunology, infectious disease, all the way to bacteria, the blame for some of that actually goes back to the medical profession itself and the media and the politicians, because they frauded this thing so horribly that now people have gone to the other extreme and they're just jumping off, the flat earth of their own reality. So that's what's going on here. So anyway, back to Robert Koch and his postulates. The 4 criteria are: the microorganism must be found in diseased but not healthy individuals. So again, that shows you how old this is. These are historical perceptions that we now understand were errors. But again, this relies on some level of subtlety and nuance in one's understanding of how microbes function and how the so-called biological terrain also functions. And so here's what I mean by this. They were looking for really aggressive and very specific pathogens in this model. But we now know, for example, that people have pathogens all the time. So again, he says the microorganism must be found in disease but not healthy individuals. I mean, a lot of people carry the bacteria called Neisseria meningitis, which causes meningitis. A lot of people carry that bacteria, but they don't have meningitis, obviously. A lot of people carry E. coli. I mean, everybody just about has E. coli in their intestines. It's just a gram-negative bacteria. But that doesn't mean that they have systemic disease caused by that. It doesn't mean they'll have traveler's diarrhea. It doesn't mean they're septic. It doesn't mean they're in kidney failure. Those are all different manifestations of E. coli-induced disease. But again, most people have E. coli in their intestines, but they keep it in check. They've got enough defenses, etc. So these are really old ways of looking at science and microbiology, but they were at least trying to provide some structure. By modern understanding, we would say that it's imperfect, but at least they were trying. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, and this is true if you look at philosophy as well. If you look at the questions of philosophy, if you look at the questions of medicine, they were still exiting the medieval times, the Dark Ages, and they're trying to transition, let's say between the 1500s and the 1800s, they're still transitioning from not knowing anything to developing, some way of establishing some criteria for reality other than just mysticism and believing that, the heavens are inhabited by a bunch of gods and, throwing lightning bolts at people and stuff like this. So, you have to understand the history of humanity and the fact that, again, during this time, people were transitioning from the so-called Dark Ages into what we now think is, a modern appreciation of things. So from that perspective, this is actually quite excellent because it's a structure, it's at least an initial structure. And just like if you're doing construction or if you're writing a book, it's not perfect the first time. Like if, obviously I've written a lot. You go through, you do your first draft, you do your second draft, you do your third draft. You get more refined with time and experience and perspective. And the same thing is true of science. Just because this was the kind of first shot at providing some structure doesn't mean that it was perfect. They didn't even think it was perfect, but it did work for some microbes, and it helped us advance the field of microbiology and immunology and eventually antibiotics and all this kind of stuff. So again, when people attack these early models, and I'm saying here accurately that even virus isolation, that was an early laboratory technique. When people argue, well, COVID has never been isolated or influenza has never been isolated. That's just so completely ignorant. First of all, the viruses have been isolated. Second of all, even if they hadn't been isolated by that particular technique, that doesn't mean that that's the definitive answer. Virus isolation doesn't work for every virus. Just like laboratory culture on agar plates doesn't work for every bacteria. And just like certain laboratory tests don't work for every single microbe. That's why we have a lot of different tests. That's why some tests are better than others. For example, I mentioned, that a lot of people have herpes simplex type 1 or herpes simplex type 2. Most of the population has one or the other. Even then, any adult who, after the age of, mid or early 20s, any adult who's never known anybody with cold sores or genital herpes or whatever, you've lived whoever that person is has lived a really small life. A lot of people have these recurrent viral infections. But, even then, for the objective, legitimate diagnosis of that, because some people, a person can be diagnosed with herpes and they don't even have herpes. Sometimes it's a bacterial infection or something that looks like herpes. So for that reason, we don't rely on clinical diagnosis of herpes. We use some type of laboratory test. And if we have a clinical presentation consistent with that infection and we have laboratory evidence, then we say, yeah, it's probably herpes. But even in that world, the three main tests, so all these geniuses who think they know what the hell they're talking about, with, the virus has never been isolated. They don't even know what they're talking about. So let me just give you a really simple example of what that conversation legitimately looks like. So let's say that somebody, and I've worked in family medicine, I've worked in emergency medicine, I've worked in urgent care. If somebody comes in and they say, hey, I think I got herpes from my boyfriend or girlfriend or toilet seat or whatever. Typically the process would be, well, how long have you had it? When do you think it started? And here's the relevance of that. If they say, well, I sat on a toilet seat on the bus and then I had a rash and that was just 2 days ago and now I think I have herpes. Well, that's not herpes. From the time of exposure to the time of developing the symptoms and the rash and the infection, you're still looking at least 10 days or 2 weeks. So if they're going to say, if somebody's, concerned that, because I had this happen, it happened to me, I'll give you the example. It just doesn't happen that fast. So sometimes simply by asking the question, when did this start or when do you think you were exposed, sometimes that alone is sufficient to kind of debunk their concern and say, we don't need to do the test. It's $250 out of the University of Washington. Save your money for something else. So that's a level of knowledge and sophistication that a lot of these people who are trying to debunk viruses, they don't even know that basic level of knowledge. So the world does have structure to it, and things are predictable. And by appreciating the structure and predictability of things, we can know things, and we can use that knowledge to ask questions. And based on the replies to those questions, we can then, begin to say yes or no to certain possibilities. But let's assume that we're still talking to this person who thinks they got herpes from a bus seat or something like that. We could do a clinical exam and look for a rash, but the problem with herpes rash is that sometimes they have a rash and it's from something else. I've seen that many times. I used to work in a urologist office. We used to have to look at people's vaginas and penises all day long because it was a urologist office. And so I got to see a lot of stuff, and I got to see things. And sometimes, for example, like I, as a young clinician, would have to do these exams on people, and I would say, well, I'm not going to put my hand up, but I would say, my goodness, this looks like textbook case of herpes. And then our chief doctor would come in, and he would say, no, that's not herpes. That's just detergent irritation, or you changed to some type of clothing that you're allergic to. Because he would do his exams. He would actually do genital exams without gloves. But anyway, like I said, I worked in a urologist clinic, and we did a lot of STD exams. So sometimes people look like they have herpes and they don't have herpes. That's why we do lab tests. Then we go to lab tests, and you can do kind of a genital scrape. I mean, who wants to do that? Nobody. But that's the gold standard, or at least it was the gold standard. You got to scrape the cells, and you got to send it to a lab, and then they look at it. Sorry, my battery keeps freaking out here. Sorry, I have to plug in my recorder to a different type of... It is plugged in, but it's apparently not plugging fast enough. So, again, we start with... this is basic medicine, but you start with a history, you go to physical exam, and then you go to lab tests. You can do cell culture, which is almost like a biopsy. That used to be the gold standard. Number two is you can do an antibody test. You can look for antibodies against herpes, and that could support or try to refute the diagnosis. However, again, a person would have to know, a doctor or a clinician, a nurse practitioner, whatever, would have to know how to interpret the tests. As I recall, the antibody test is only around 70% accurate. So again, these people who are trying to refute the existence of viruses by saying, well, it's never been cultured, they're so out of the conversation, they don't even know how out of the conversation they are. Because you have to think in terms of laboratory testing, you have to think of sensitivity and specificity. And then the third test, as I mentioned, there are three tests. The third test for herpes, the laboratory test, is called herpes Western blot. Originally, that was only performed from the University of Washington in Seattle. I don't know if that's still true. They may have, lost their patent or sold it to someone else by now. But originally, that was the most reliable test, and it was in the 90 percentages, like 99% accurate. It was, last time I checked, which was many years ago, it was considered the gold standard. So let me go back, let me rewind just a little bit. I had said regarding the diagnosis of herpes that sometimes just the time frame was sufficient. And so it is. So one time I was doing an exam, a gynecologic exam on a patient. She reported that she had herpes. We obviously had to do the exam anyway. And I finished the exam, and as I was taking my glove off, I think that I touched my hand while I was taking the infected glove off. So I was a young doctor at the time, so I kind of freaked out. And what I did after that is I cleaned my hand very aggressively with alcohol and cotton swab thing, just to try to clean off. I thought I had been, exposed, and I cleaned it off. I mean, it's totally reasonable. Everybody would have done the same thing. But as a result of, trying to clean my hand with this cotton swab and alcohol, I irritated the skin. And then 2 days later, I had like a rash from just from the friction of the cotton ball, because I had tried to clean my hand so aggressively. It was right here in my hand. I remember it anyway. But the fact is, even if it had been contamination of herpes, it wouldn't have developed a rash within 2 days. So you have to know kind of the life cycle of, microbiology in order to understand some of these things. So the 4 criteria, going back to Koch's postulates, the microorganism has to be found in diseased but not healthy individuals. We now know that we have to soften up that idea, even though, again, some microbes are more pathogenic than others. The microorganism must be cultured from the diseased individual. This is back when they thought people were sterile and they only had like one infection at a time or one bacteria at a time. Sorry, my screen keeps flashing for some reason, so I'm going to close out one of the programs. Number 3, inoculation of a healthy individual with the cultured microorganism must recapitulated. The article says, obviously that's bad grammar, must recapitulate the disease. So again, this is back in the 1800s. They thought everyone was completely sterile, and then you got exposed to one microbe, and then you got sick. See? I mean, now we know people have viruses and bacteria all the time. And finally, the microorganism must be re-isolated from the inoculated disease individual and matched to the original microorganism. So it's kind of a way of confirming. The 4th step seems a bit redundant, but it's a confirmatory step. So you'll see that. I'll post this article on the website just for completeness. I'm going to close that article. You'll see that in the steps of how to do a virus isolation process. So basically, you collect the sample from a diseased animal or person, or even a plant, because plants get viruses as well. You collect a sample, you try to cultivate it in a cell culture, because viruses require living cells in order to replicate. You observe cell death and some other expected consequences of the viral infection. Then you try to re-isolate the virus and do some type of confirmatory test. So it's the same thing as Koch's postulates. Identify, isolate, culture, and then retest. So I'm going to close that page as well. And then I have to blur out my screen. So let's go back to these articles. Here's another article on Koch's postulates. It was never perfect, but it was at least workable. So then I've got 3 articles on laboratory assessment of viral infections. And some of these are, a couple years old. This one's from 1983. The other ones are a little more current, or a lot more current. Oh, this one's not so much more current. This is 1988. And then this one is 2014. So again, people who say that the viruses have never been isolated, I mean, they just have no idea what they're talking about. Laboratory techniques for diagnosis of virus infections. This was published in a textbook of medical virology, 1983. I'll post this article. I'll probably just post the 3 on laboratory assessment because they're most specific. And some of these are, again, I mean, a person would have to have some perspective on how labs function and what's available. So this, for example, is electron microscopy. It says electron microscopy of rotavirus in fecal sample from a child with diarrhea. So most labs are not going to do electron microscopy. Just like I would guess that most labs these days don't even do virus isolation, or maybe only for very specific viruses. But I doubt it. For one reason, they don't want to handle live viruses. And that would be a different level of, laboratory certification and security and all this kind of stuff. So, again, these people who say, oh, well, the virus has never been isolated, I mean, they're just so out of touch with clinical reality that it's bare. Their concerns are, I try to, we all want to make everyone feel safe and like their concerns are legitimate, but it's almost not even a legitimate concern. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's just a waste of time. So anyway, here's a picture of rotavirus. But again, most laboratories are not going to perform electron microscopy, just like most laboratories these days aren't going to bother with virus isolation. So here's another technique, looking at cells and doing kind of a what's called immunofluorescence, which is trying to attack or target the virus particles with an kind of a modified antibody that has an antibody on one side and then a fluorescent tracer on the other. So you can also look at antibodies, but again, that requires some level. A person would have to know certain basic concepts of laboratory medicine, like pre-predictive value, sensitivity, specificity, some basic things like that. Plus, titers. A lot of times we have to look at titers to determine if it's an infection worth being concerned about. Back in the days of Robert Koch, things were kind of black and white because they believed that people were sterile, like without any bacteria or viruses, and then they encountered a pathogen and then got sick. Now we know that's not true. So rather than, even with laboratory testing, you can't look at it in terms of black and white a lot of times. You have to look at it in terms of history, physical exam, laboratory confirmation, but then clinical context again. Is this an infection that we're actually concerned about? For example, and this is a good example, a bacteria called Pseudomonas aeruginosa can cause devastating fatal infections. Well, I've seen plenty of patients with Pseudomonas aeruginosa, mostly people with autoimmune disease, specifically autoimmune type of neuropathy, including multiple sclerosis. So again, that requires clinical contextualization. Even if we do a lab test that states and shows that a person has Pseudomonas aeruginosa, it doesn't mean that they're going to die from Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It could be contributing to their disease, but again, all of this requires a level of knowledge and a level of clinical perspective that a lot of people just don't have. And apparently these people who are saying that viruses don't exist, they're not even on the team. They're not even good players on the team. They're not even in the ball field of the conversation. So I'll post this other article about virus isolation and identification. But like I said, no laboratory test is going to be perfect for every microbe. So, even if we were to say, oh, well, this virus hasn't been cultured, even if we were to say that, it doesn't matter because viral culture may not be the appropriate method for that particular microbe. Just like I said before, antibody testing might not be the perfect method for looking for diseases. maybe that particular test is only 70% accurate. And then, like I said, with herpes, instead of just looking at antibodies, you want to go with Western blot, which is like 95 or 99% sensitive and specific. Let's see what they say about herpes here. Yeah, so again, even with herpes, you have to distinguish between type 1 and type 2. So those are just a few ideas around this whole thing about this absurd fad that people are participating in, where they want to convince themselves that viruses don't exist. I don't know why that keeps bouncing to the wrong resolution. They want to convince themselves that viruses don't exist, that reality doesn't exist, that they can wish themselves out of the complexity of life. And the excuse that I see floating around is that virus infections don't exist. It's just a detoxification reaction from your body. Well, they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, I've written chapters and I've done extensive research reviews on detoxification reactions. They're confused, but they don't even know what they're talking about. They're trying to confuse a detoxification reaction from a Herxheimer reaction, two totally different things. And then trying to say that a Herxheimer reaction is the same as a detox reaction, and that's the same thing as an infection. I mean, those are different things. So if all of this is propaganda, as some people say, they say that it's just medical propaganda, the whole idea of viruses. Well, does that mean that dogs are also susceptible to medical propaganda written in English? I mean, dogs and other animals get virus infections. Even dolphins get herpes infections. And a couple of years ago, a bunch of dolphins died, and they said it was because of virus infections. But I mean, animals get virus infections. I told you a minute ago, some plants even get virus infections. I mean, viruses for plants exist. That's why, one of them is called the tobacco mosaic virus. I mean, does that mean that plants have been indoctrinated by medical propaganda in English? Because the plants are fooling themselves into thinking that they have tobacco mosaic virus. I mean, that's the kind of absurdity that these people are engaged in. I mean, they're totally disconnected, again, not only from common human experience, but obviously from the reality of, research and things like this. So I'll try to clean up this video and get it posted, today, hopefully without spending too many hours doing that. I mean, the process of editing these videos takes, like this one's only, 35 minutes at this moment, but it'll take me, 2 hours to edit it and format it so it's, a reasonable presentation. But anyway, for those of you who follow my work, I hope that you won't fall into this, social absurdity of thinking that viruses don't exist and that it hasn't been isolated. I mean, those are just absurd arguments. Because like I said, virus isolation is only one of many laboratory methods, and it was never perfect. It's certainly not perfect now. It's completely outdated, except for the rarest of infections. Most labs probably don't do it. Like I said before, most doctors aren't going to take the samples anyway. A person would have to have some perspective and knowledge to even place the technology of viral isolation into the proper context, into a practical context. So again, like I said, when people say viruses don't exist, they have no idea what they're talking about. When people say the virus hasn't been isolated, I don't care if it's been isolated or not. That's only one of many laboratory tests that we have for any given, virus infection. So, I mean, the whole thing is just weird. I said that I would read, at least in one of these renditions of this video. I did reply to somebody today, and this was a good conversation between someone who I don't know, but who appears to be reasonable. So let me just read what I replied. I said that people who deny, and I'll post this on the website, people who deny that infections exist and that viruses, sorry, one more time. People who deny that infections exist and that viruses exist are demonstrating their ignorance of the entire basis of evidence, which started with Koch's postulates, but certainly didn't end there. As I said before, we all know people who have had, we all know people who have herpes. And number two is what I said, any of these people should work for a weekend in an STD, sexually transmitted disease clinic, and then try to convince other people that viruses don't exist. I then give the example of, kind of the common situation in emergency medicine of a woman presenting with lower abdominal pain and fever, turns out to be pelvic inflammatory disease, typically from chlamydia or gonorrhea. Those patients hopefully and commonly respond to intravenous antibiotics. So again, these people who are saying that infections don't exist, I mean, try working in a hospital, or like I have, try working in a hospital, an outpatient clinic, or a specialty office like urology. Try working in one of those clinics and then telling people, oh, well, your rash doesn't exist. Your genitals are just on fire because of a detoxification reaction. I mean, that's just absurd. These people are living in their own private fantasy worlds. And again, like I said before, I understand the irony. After 5 years of bullshit propaganda about the COVID virus, now people have gone to the opposite extreme, and the blame is clearly on the heads of those in politics and medicine for perpetuating their own fraud. But now that fraud has morphed into a different type of intellectual fraud. So I'll post all of this and I'll leave it at that. So thanks for your attention and take care.
I'm an old soul, got a funky sound. Gonna sing a song, turn the world around. I'll whoop that ass, you know I got the moves. Spank that ass, I'm gonna make you blue. I ain't no player, I'm just here to shake